James Riddle Hoffa served as the International Brotherhood of Teamsters president from 1958 to 1971. The Teamsters were originally known as a labor union for drivers. At age 18, Hoffa succeeded in getting dock workers better pay by organizing a strike. He began organizing for the Teamsters a year later and gradually rose through the ranks. Hoffa's influence as president of the Teamsters in the US was significant. At the time, 90% of US transportation was controlled by the Teamsters, who were controlled by Hoffa. In 1941, Hoffa and the Teamsters were engaged in a turf battle with rivals in Detroit. It's here, according to author and reporter Dan Moldea, that Hoffa got involved with the mob. Hoffa hired the mob to get rid of these rivals in the city, and although this worked, after this, the mafia essentially owned Hoffa. The mob and Hoffa formed a symbiotic relationship. The mob was able to benefit from taking loans out of the Teamsters pension fund, funneling these funds into the financing of many Las Vegas casinos. Hoffa and the Teamsters in turn got a favorable return on these loans. Despite Hoffa's connections to the mob, he was beloved by union workers, as he was known for increasing benefits and wages for workers. Hoffa had a stable relationship with the mob in the 1940s and 1950s, but this began to splinter after he went to prison. Hoffa started serving a 13-year sentence behind bars in 1967 for crimes including bribery, jury tampering, and mail fraud. Then, in 1971, President Richard Nixon pardoned Hoffa with the promise that Hoffa would abstain from any union involvement until 1980. This pardon would oddly set into motion events that would lead to Hoffa's downfall. 4 years later, in early July, federal investigators found that the Teamsters' largest pension fund had been robbed of hundreds of millions of dollars, and only 2 weeks later, Hoffa vanished. The timing of these two occurrences seems to suggest more than a coincidence. With the discovery of hundreds of millions of dollars going missing from the Teamsters pension fund, and Hoffa barred from the Teamsters and free from jail, it stands to reason that Hoffa could have made it known to investigators that the mafia was involved with the Teamsters pension funds. Obviously, the mafia would not want this to happen. As such, let's examine Hoffa's disappearance. On July 30th, 1975, 62-year-old Hoffa was seen outside a Detroit area restaurant called the Matches Red Fox. According to notes written by Hoffa to his family, Hoffa was asked to meet two acquaintances at 2 p.m. at this restaurant. The acquaintances were suspects Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone and Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, both members of the mafia. Provenzano was also a Teamster. However, neither Giacalone nor Provenzano showed up to the meeting, and they both insisted that there had been no meeting organized when questioned by the FBI. Giacalone and Provenzano technically have alibis the day of Hoffa's disappearance. Giacalone was at the Southfield Athletic Club, noticeably chatting up people he knew and didn't know. Investigators suspected this behavior as Giacalone trying to solidify an alibi. Provenzano was in New Jersey, not Michigan, with his brother Salvatore Sammy Pro Provenzano all afternoon playing cards in a union hall. Witness statements that Hoffa entered a burgundy Mercury Marquis with 3 men seems to be corroborated by DNA evidence from years later. A hair found in the car was confirmed to belong to Hoffa. Therefore, it's plausible, if not likely, that this is the car that transported Hoffa to the secondary location where he was killed. Witnesses stated that the driver of the car looked to be a man named Charles Chucky O'Brien, who was known to be like a surrogate son and protege to Hoffa. Police denied that Hoffa entered that car and any involvement with Hoffa's disappearance. However, O'Brien was scrutinized by investigators after Hoffa's disappearance, with some maintaining that O'Brien's relationship with Hoffa had suffered after O'Brien felt that Hoffa should have gotten him better positions in the Teamsters. Salmon had spilled blood in the back seat, so he needed to get it cleaned. German Shepherds also found Hoffa's scent in both the back seat and the trunk. Hoffa's son has said that when he asked O'Brien if he was involved in his father's disappearance, O'Brien quickly fled the room. Both literal searches in the area and searches through phone and other records, but unfortunately, Hoffa's body was never found. Before we get into the theories, one thing seems to be generally agreed upon, that Hoffa, in some way, was killed by the Mafia. The Hoffa memo, a document written in January 1976 by federal investigators, indicates that authorities suspected that the Mafia, concerned that Hoffa would make it known they had infiltrated the Teamsters and accessed its pension fund to pay for its illegal operations, decided to kill him. As for the question of why Hoffa would divulge information to investigators, one book on the case, I Heard You Paint Houses, suggests that the Mafia was concerned that Hoffa, who was anxious to get back into union leadership, would be willing to swap information with the authorities to lift his 1980 restriction on union activity that Nixon ordered. Hoffa was also apparently vocal about trying to get the mob out of the union and the union's pension fund. Even still, despite knowing that someone in the mob likely killed Hoffa, investigators could never figure out who it actually was. 4 months into the investigation, Ralph Picardo, an inmate in New Jersey, claimed that he had information obtained while one of Hoffa's killers visited him in prison. Picardo's information allowed the investigators to form their list of suspects, most of which were connected to Provenzano, one of the men that Hoffa was supposed to meet the day he disappeared. However, all of the suspects eventually took the fifth and didn't testify, which dashed any hope of an indictment and led to an essential cold case. And with that, let's get into the theories. One theory is that Hoffa was killed by Salvatore Bergoglio at Roland McMaster's horse farm in Milford Township. McMaster was an enforcer for the Teamsters. This theory is supported by the Hoffa Wars author Dan Moldea, who interviewed Salvatore Bergoglio before Bergoglio was killed. In 2006, the FBI searched for Hoffa at the horse farm to no avail. However, Moldea believes that Bergoglio killed Hoffa at the farm, and that his body was then put in a 55-gallon drum and sent to a mafia-controlled landfill in New Jersey in a Gateway transportation truck. The trucking company's president was a Teamster pension fund trustee, since died, claimed to have been paid $40,000 to kill Hoffa by the mob. He explained that, at the ultimate orders of powerful mob figure Russell Bufalino, he drove to Detroit with 4 other mob members, most likely Tony Provenzano, Gabriel and Salvatore Bergoglio, and Thomas Andretta, and picked up Hoffa at a suburban restaurant. They then knocked Hoffa out, stabbed him with a hunting knife in the skull, and transported the body to New Jersey in a car trunk that was later crushed and sold as scrap metal. Kuklinski said, quote, "He's part of a car somewhere in Japan right now," end quote. Patrick Kane, a police officer who was part of the effort to put Kuklinski behind bars, believes that Kuklinski is telling the truth. However, others dismiss Kuklinski's claims, saying that he was a gross liar and exaggerator. Robert Garrity, crime expert and former FBI agent, has called this claim, quote, "the most embarrassing one to date," and taken to a funeral home controlled by the mob where it was cremated. Sheeran apparently felt very guilty for betraying Hoffa, but did so because he would also be killed if he refused. Sheeran says that he purposefully sat in the front passenger seat of the car to send a secret warning to Hoffa. Hoffa always sat in the front passenger seat, so Sheeran hoped that Hoffa would notice there was something amiss with the gathering. Hoffa's son reportedly said that he believed his father would have entered the car with Sheeran inside, and that he wouldn't have done that if it had been other suspects. Furthermore, according to the FBI, Sheeran was in the Detroit area when Hoffa vanished. Sheeran even named a house where the murder took place, but attempts to locate Hoffa's blood evidence led nowhere. According to reporter David Ashenfelter, it's possible Sheeran is telling the truth, but there isn't really any evidence apart from his word. It's possible that Sheeran may have wanted to clear his guilty conscience before dying, especially with his strong Catholic faith. Perhaps one day, a new break in the case will shed some light on what happened that one afternoon in Michigan, but for now, the case remains unsolved.